So how do you feel when a candidate asks you if you have any hesitations about their candidacy?
That is one of my least favorite interview questions, and we tell our candidates not to ask it. In general, I think the problem with that question, a lot of the advice comes from this idea that like you're being a little bit brave, you get to hear the objections, you get to handle it, you get to kind of show the interviewer that you care about their perspective on your current candidacy compared to who else they might be interviewing. But I think all of that misses the two major downsides of that question. The first is it's quite awkward for the interviewer to answer that, and not in like they're an awkward person sort of way. Even someone like me who's really comfortable giving feedback live on an interview, if I have an objection that you haven't really thought back on, I'm not really looking for you to engage it directly. My questions for you will be centered around getting you to answer it indirectly. And so me, saying something like, yeah, my hesitation is you don't have XYZ experience. Look, if I'm a bad interviewer, I don't find another way to ask you that. Yeah, it's a problem. But if I'm a good interviewer and you haven't answered that, it's probably because you're actually directly weak on that subject. I don't want you to kind of play with me and play with that question directly, because it's kind of like saying, I'm giving you the answers to the game, and you just need to reformat it back to me. That doesn't work. The second thing about that is it actually structurally is not great for the interview. It's actually structurally not great for the interview. What I mean by that is you're at the end of this process and you want to, it's actually also structurally not great for the interview because this is like a last question and you want to leave on a relatively positive note. And so if the last thing you're prompting my brain with is what is the problem with you, I'm now going to, even if the conversation winds up being positive or somewhat constructive, I'm going to leave having been asked and prompted in my brain to come up with what your flaws are.
Interesting.
So I just think like candidates should avoid that question, and TikTok career coaches just have to give that advice.
I think that's good advice. What's the most awkward answer you've given to that question?
I'm definitely honest. That's the hard part, is I am honest about it.
I believe that.
Yeah, and so I think, like, I don't think any of them have been awkward because I'm, smart enough to frame things the right way where the person can empathize with what I'm saying and they understand the context of who they are. But I think the most awkward thing that's happened, I remember one person I gave the feedback to around their experience, what they lacked. And it was literal. They couldn't fight against it. I knew their background. I asked questions about it. And they just tried to like shoehorn a bunch of other examples in. This is very common. A lot of people do this across the board in interviews. But when they're doing it so directly, this is why this question is so bad, it was just a lot for me to like sit there and go, oh man, like this sounds awful. It's almost like their candidacy is way worse because now they were attempting to tackle it with like analogies that made them seem off. It's kind of like, if you're making up an answer or you're making up your answer to the objection in that case, you're very likely to expose weird thinking. Or it's kind of like, okay, you've gotten the cheat code to what your problem with your candidacy is, but you actually don't have the material required to craft a proper response. And now you look kind of off for attempting to shoehorn a bunch of other stuff, square peg, round hole sort of thing.
Right.
Yeah.
Interesting. I mean, personally, I prefer when candidates ask me for feedback via email after the interview rather than ask me, during the interview at the end, once again, kind of leaving a bad taste in your mouth. So I agree.
And more companies should give real feedback. I think a lot of them are scared for legal reasons that I've looked this up before. I don't think a lot of companies get smacked for giving feedback, yet that's their fear. You have to do it appropriately, and there probably should be some internal, review mechanisms for when companies do decide to give candidates feedback. But I think a lot more candidates appreciate it than not. Our team gets some negative reactions sometimes when we give feedback, but I think it's worth it because the people who we help and support, we turn them into real fans because they appreciate what we've been able to give them as far as value for their time.
100%.